Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're very excited to be hosting this right before finals, the final fall InCHIP lecture series. I am Dr. Sandy Chifulius. I am a professor in the NIH School of Education, and I am part of what Dr. Park is going to talk about is our U24 network on emotional well-being. That said, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Crystal Park. Many of the attendees here probably are already familiar with Dr. Park, given her expansive and impactful research agenda. She is a major force in what is known about spirituality, meaning, and health. Dr. Park's research focuses on multiple aspects of coping with stressful events, such as the roles of religious beliefs and religious coping, the phenomenon of stress-related growth, and the making of meaning in the context of traumatic events and life-threatening illnesses. Dr. Park's more recent work has focused on integrative approaches to health, investigating mind-body relationships, particularly the science of yoga. It is this focus that Dr. Fumiko Heft and I are most particularly delighted to be collaborating with her as we join forces to tackle issues in emotional well-being measurement, mechanisms, and mind-body intervention. And without further ado, I will turn it to Dr. Park to tell us more about all of this work.
Well, thank you, Sandy, for that nice introduction. I am delighted to be here today, and just wish I was looking at a real audience instead of a list of names, but I see a lot of familiar names, friends and colleagues, so it's nice to at least see your name. I would actually like to see your face. And really delighted to be here to talk about our network. And that Sandy just kind of alluded to. So what happened with the networks is that NIH put out a call for networks on emotional well-being. It was a little bit vague exactly what they were looking for, but we joined forces, Fumiko Heft and Sandy and I, to put in a call, and we were one of the networks that was funded. So NIH is making a big investment in emotional well-being. So there's 6 networks that were funded to do this, and I was looking at this figure. So each of the networks has a little logo. Ours is the M3EWB, which I think is probably the best looking of the logos there. I'm biased, but so this is our network. It is to advance the science of mechanisms underlying mind-body interventions and measurement of emotional well-being. And there in the corner is information on how to find our website and to connect with us. We really welcome people to join our network. We're trying to grow the network and be part of this network of networks. So our particular network is to create this network to develop our understanding of emotional well-being measurement approaches and their role in mind-body interventions. I think of the 6 networks, we're really the only one that's explicitly focusing on mind-body issues. And so we have a number of things we've been working on, creating a taxonomy of the essential components of emotional well-being, establishing a measures toolkit, and identifying mechanisms to inform intervention theory. So this is our first year of the network, this is the first lecture. Wanted to give you a heads up that in the spring, we're gonna have one of our advisory board members of our network, John Salzman, who's at Wake Forest School of Medicine, giving a talk on emotional well-being. So something to look out for in the spring. Another thing our network is doing is we have a request for applications available right now. So you see the money growing on the trees there. Up to $30,000 for 1-year research projects on measuring emotional well-being. The aim of this RFA is to really try to fill some gaps in the measurement of emotional well-being. So, and we're, not just self-reports, we're really interested in expanding how we might measure emotional well-being behaviorally or physiologically, as well as different populations and different age groups. So, really kind of thinking about emotional well-being kind of broadly. So, emotional well-being, it's an exciting topic. It's really, I think it's a really big shift for NIH to be investing in emotional well-being, because even though the National Institutes of Health has health in the title, most people know that NIH is primarily National Institute of Illness, because we're really focusing on all the problems and how to fix the problems, how to help people, recover from cancer, or prevention hasn't been a big focus, and nor has this sort of more positive side, the flourishing side of health. And so when you start digging into emotional well-being, what you realize is that it is not just the flip side of ill-being or illness, but it's actually kind of moving us towards thinking about just, either you're ill or you're not ill, but there's this whole other side of, you can be beyond neutral, right? So you can actually flourish or have these positive aspects of well-being. And that's kind of, like I said, I think that has been a really big shift at NIH. So what is emotional well-being? That might seem like a simple question. It turns out it's actually a really complicated one. And like so many of the things that we do, the definition is contentious. There's not an agreed upon standard. And so we have spent an inordinate amount of time, actually, of not just our network, but all of the networks have been meeting since springtime to try to come up with a definition that we can all live with, and that would help us to work together so that we are more productive as a group of scholars. So it's been very challenging to kind of figure out a definition. And this is what, after many, many meetings, we've come up with. Emotional well-being encompasses how good an individual feels generally, in the moment, and about life overall. And so unpack that a little bit. It's just how positive somebody feels or how good they feel generally and right now. And then this issue of about life overall, which is a bit more of a reflection. So these experiential features really focus on the emotional quality of everyday experiences, but there's also a reflective aspect of emotional well-being, which is making those judgments about how satisfied are you with your life? Do you have a sense that your life is meaningful? Can you pursue goals that extend beyond yourself? Maybe extend beyond yourself. So when we're thinking about emotional well-being and the research that I'm going to talk about today, and the research that we're hoping our network generates and works along with these other groups to do, is really not just about emotions per se, like happiness, but also these more reflective pieces. And that makes it a little bit complicated. And then the last part that we want to highlight is that these features occur in the context of culture, life circumstances, resources, and life course. And everybody who wants to help to create this definition wants to put in their own, particular spin on those particular things, like culture or life circumstances. So it makes it even more complicated. So when we're measuring experiential features of emotional well-being, we often use the PANAS, or I actually like the Spain better. These are measures of just emotions and the directions. How frequently do you feel each? That's going to give you how people generally feel. You can change these definitions if you're trying to get to that piece of EWB that's like, how do you feel right now? You could ask it that way. So the research that's looked at emotional well-being generally has been much more focused on this sort of emotional piece. When we're talking about measuring the reflective features of emotional well-being, life satisfaction, the Diener's measure of life satisfaction, and these are a couple of sample items, has gotten, it's been used thousands and thousands of times. Sense of meaning in life, we often use a questionnaire called the Milk Meaning in Life questionnaire. My life has a clear sense of purpose. I have a good sense of what makes life meaningful. So those are kind of getting at the meaning piece of emotional well-being. And then there's this issue of ability to pursue goals that can extend beyond the self. This piece is very hard to measure. I haven't seen a lot of research in the mind-body space that measures this ability to pursue goals. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of these, and particularly that issue of the goals. So I mentioned that our network is kind of unique in that we're kind of not just looking at EWB, but we want to look at it in the context of mind body. And there's two ways that this kind of plays out in mind body interventions. So mind body interventions involve behavioral interventions that purport to influence both the mind and the body. And there's a bunch of different MBIs. Yoga is the one I'm most familiar with. There's also a lot of research on meditation. There's some on Tai Chi, Qigong, and breathing, pranayama or breathing exercises, regulated breathing. And then there's other MBIs. And, some people will put in here things like art therapy and dance therapy. And, the boundaries are fuzzy in terms of what mind body interventions are. And so this can play out in a couple ways. Mind body interventions like yoga or Tai Chi or meditation, predicting emotional well-being. So emotional well-being in these kinds of interventions, the emotional well-being is the desired outcome or focus, or it can take more of a mediator effect. So one of the ways that you might think, how does yoga help pain? Maybe because it helps people to feel more satisfied with their lives or find more meaning in their life, and that helps them to experience less pain. So here we're thinking about emotional well-being as the mechanism by which mind-body interventions can produce change. So what is the evidence base currently for emotional well-being in the context of MBIs? And I should mention that we are going to have a second grant competition later in our grant that's going to try to fund some research looking at this issue. And hopefully some people already have studies going that they might be able to look at some of the EWB in ongoing studies, or maybe do some other kinds of creative things to try to understand the role of EWB a little better. Right now, there's just not a lot of good evidence on mind body interventions and emotional well-being. And the reason for that is a little bit complex. First of all, most of the research on MBIs focuses on alleviating distress or dysfunction. As I mentioned, it's a lot easier to get. It's not easy to get a grant, but it's easier to get a grant focused on pain or depression than on happiness or joy. It's just the way that our funding situation is set up. So there just hasn't been a lot of emphasis on emotional well-being generally. And then when there is research, it tends to be on positive affect or affect balance, a ratio positive to negative emotion. And most of the time, even in studies where it's looked at this, it tends to be secondary outcomes, not the primary outcome. It's in like a roster of like 10 potential secondary outcomes. So just a very minor, almost like an afterthought. Very little mechanistic work on mind-body issues. There is the work that's been done on like yoga or meditation is very outcomes driven. So does it help with depression? Does it help with pain? Does it help with headaches? You know, as opposed to how does it work? So that the funders like NCCIH are just starting to try to push people to say, we know that a lot of this stuff works, but why does it work? What's going on? And then something that is really bad about a lot of the research in mind-body interventions is the rigor is just not of high quality, and that's changing over time, especially in the past 10 years or so. There's been so much emphasis on you know, in fidelity of treatments and all of the ways that bias has crept into a lot of the interventions to try to make these more rigorous. But I wanted to just kind of review a little bit of the emotional well-being research as an outcome. Like I mentioned, in terms of experiential emotional well-being, the hedonic qualities, positive affect or affect balance or happiness. There are studies that have shown that MBIs, especially yoga and meditation, lead to more positive affect or favorable positive negative affect balance. And this is just a meta-analysis that was focusing on positive mental health that did highlight some of that. So for example, these are just some samples. Engineers in India, boys, women with chronic stress. So there are RCTs of yoga and experiential emotional well-being out there, not a lot of them. And like I said, they tend to be secondary outcomes. A lot less about the reflective emotional well-being. So this part of emotional well-being is really much harder to find good research on life satisfaction, sense of meaning, and ability to pursue goals. So when I was looking for this, this is a systematic review of yoga and positive mental health that found 2 studies of yoga that had a measure of life satisfaction and did find some effects. Same with meditation. It's out there, but surprisingly, not a lot of research. And I put these citations here so you can sort of get a sense of the quality of the journals that this stuff is published in, or not your JAMA articles. And same with meaning in life. There were few like correlational studies that show the longer people did MBIs, the more meaning in life they had. There's one study that everybody cites that from 2011 that compared to a wait list, people doing yoga increased their meaning in life. Not super strong evidence, not something you'd probably want to hang your hat on. And then this issue, the reflective piece of emotional well-being, how we define goal pursuit. I mentioned that's really difficult, your ability to pursue your goals. This is one way that one study did using the agency subscale of the Hope Scale, Snyder's Hope Scale. So it's a self-report scale, and this was by Todd Cashton and some other people. Todd is one of the advisors on our board, and they did a mindfulness yoga intervention with a NCAA athletic team. And it's really interesting because I read this study, and they don't actually in the entire study say what those people's sport was. So I was going to email Todd and ask him, but anyway, which I just thought was strange. But anyway. In that study, this Hope Scale, they called it goal-directed energy. So that's one way we might study emotional well-being. Another way I was thinking we could think about ability to pursue goals. This was a paper that I did with some colleagues, and we were looking at yoga as a self-regulation promoting intervention with lots of pieces. So yoga, of course, has some meditation. Yoga has some physical components. It's a complicated intervention, But what we were proposing in this paper is that there's a lot of this bottom up sort of training that you get when you do yoga that helps you with executive functioning, helps you with attention, helps you with goal monitoring, things that would be involved in goal pursuit. And so I was thinking about studies that use a goal pursuit measure more like self-control, like you can override incipient responses. And there are a few studies that have shown that yoga did increase people's self-control over time. And then there was a study with female inmates that did not find effects on self-control from yoga. Meditation also related to that sort of self-control variable. There are a few studies of mindfulness meditation. One of the things, this was an interesting study that found that in a male prison population, the go, no-go task, which is sort of it's like a behavioral measure of overriding incipient responses, actually did find that yoga helped. And then another study used a behavioral task called the Stroop task, if you're familiar with that, where the colors and the names of the colors don't match, and people have it. Takes time to read this properly, and they found in a single session that experienced yogis did better. So that's kind of clever and maybe an interesting way to get at some of the mechanisms of self-control that are happening. The other way that we can look at MBIs and emotional well-being, as I mentioned, is as a mediator or mechanism. And the NIH put a lot of effort into science of behavior change, which is just a very mechanistic way of trying to identify how things work, and with the idea being that if we understand it, we can optimize it. We can maybe do some things to potentiate the intervention, make it stronger if we understand what the active ingredients are. And there's so little research on this. Like, there's just so little research on this. So we did a study of Kripalu yoga, and we actually did this at Storrs and also up in Boston. And this was funded by NCCIH as well. This was this is only the Storrs part of the sample that we were looking at here. So, and it's a pilot study. It was in our 34. But we were able to do a little bit of testing of mediators of that intervention, which, like I said, there's just so little out there. So what we were interested in is the extent to which yoga leads to decreased stress. We were taking people who were reporting high levels of stress on a self-report measure, and seeing if yoga helped, and if, to the extent that yoga helped, was it through some of these mediators, some of which are related to emotional well-being. So the mediators we looked at were mindfulness, interoceptive awareness, which is just an awareness of what's happening inside your body, spiritual well-being, which includes spiritual attachment and also a sense of meaning in life, self-compassion, and then that self-control variable. In our study, we found that all of the mediators except self-compassion increased, but in terms of corresponding as a mediator of yoga's effects, the self-control didn't come out, but the spiritual well-being and self-compassion, the other mediators did. So that was just a sort of a teaser, a little hint of what might be going on with yoga that can lead to decreased stress. So some of that emotional well-being may be helpful in that regard. So, mind-body interventions are a promising context for promoting emotional well-being, and through them, better health. And there's a couple of things that are really positive about mind-body interventions. They're taking this holistic approach to health and wellness And that's something that NCCIH and the VA system are all moving towards this whole person health, kind of a holistic view of people. So MBIs are really well positioned. They're highly accessible. They're pretty easy to deliver. They're scalable. They're disseminable. And they're endlessly adaptable. There's so many different ways that you can adapt mind-body interventions for particular populations or for particular contexts. So I think that there's a lot of promise for these. So for future research directions, I think diversity among facets of emotional well-being. So there is this underlying construct of emotional well-being, but then there's it's important to think about, the meaning in life piece of it versus the happiness piece. That emotional well-being is comprised of these different facets. Clearly, there's a lot of diversity among mind-body interventions. So they may not all work the same way. They may not all have the same effects. So there's a lot of complexity there. And then there's diversity within mind-body interventions. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit more because that's a big part of the research that I do. Is even within yoga, there are multitudes. So in a lot of the research, we see that yoga has these effects, like some of the results that I just talked about a few minutes ago. So we say yoga has these physiological effects, these psychological effects that affect mental health and physical health, and that's great. But from my perspective, I really wanted to understand more about what it is in that box. There's a lot of varieties of yoga. Hatha yoga refers to the umbrella of yogas that involve physical postures, which is pretty much what we have in the Western world. Is almost all Hatha yoga. So it involves poses, but also other aspects. But even within Hatha, there's all sorts of schools of yoga. There's like over 200, and I just listed a few of the primary ones here that you may be familiar with or maybe practice. But that is just, it's really exciting because there's just a lot of differences there that may have different effects. And so this was a study, a series of studies that we did. This was a grant that we got to really dive into what is yoga, what are the dimensions of yoga, and how could we possibly capture something as complex as yoga. And this was just like such an amazing project. It was so much fun to really just get immersed in what yoga is and be able to really try to unpack it. What ultimately came out of this is that we were hoping for about 6 dimensions of yoga, like maybe we could figure out how to measure, and we came up with 14. And I have them listed there on the side. They are, yoga varies in terms of how much each of these components in any given intervention is emphasized. So some yogas are very physical and very difficult postures. Some yogas are more restorative or relaxing. Some really emphasize breath work. Some really emphasize spirituality. And it's really complex too, because each of these is a unique dimension. It's not like you can take a pie and say, 30% of it's asana or postures and 30% of it's breathing, because you do them at the same time. So it's really complicated. We designed this EPIC. This is the tool that we created, the Essential Properties of Yoga questionnaire, as an observational tool, so that every intervention would be designed such that it would get a particular score. So everybody in the class is getting the exact same intervention. But you can also use it as a self-report measure, because what we found is that even though objectively it scores one way, people perceive it in a different way, and it's not clear which of those is actually more relevant. This is a little spider graph that showed that 3 kinds of yoga you may be familiar with: Kundalini, Iyengar, and Bikram. Bikram is the like 105-degree yoga. And the Bikram was much more on the physicality side. The Kundalini was much more on the spirituality side. And Iyengar had a lot more individual attention. So it's really interesting to see how those different yoga traditions and styles. So you might think about, wow, yoga is not yoga, depending on the type of intervention that you're doing. This might have really different kinds of effects. So we have this more complex view of yoga where it's not a black box, and you can think about how yoga that emphasizes breath work, or yoga that emphasizes meditation, or yoga that's more physically challenging might have really different effects on emotional well-being and physical well-being through these more complex pathways. So there's a lot to be done in that regard as well. One of the things we did as part of the EPIC development is single sessions of yoga where we did little pre-post for these different styles of yoga. And so we took a quick look at how different styles of yoga might change psychosocial resources and emotional well-being across a single session. And the results are just correlational, and again, more like a tease. But we were really interested in a theoretical model of yoga's effects on emotional well-being. So whether those different aspects have different effects on positive engagement, vitality or revitalization, tranquility, another emotional positive emotion, and then exhaustion. And so the results were complex. So if you want to read the paper and really take a close look at it, but we did see the important thing is we did see, based on these EPIC differences, we also the VPPS is the Vanderbilt. It was created for psychotherapy, but how warm the teacher was, we adapted it for the teacher, and the Borg is the exertion. So the notion of this, the bottom line here is that yoga characteristics differ across different types of yoga, and that makes a difference in how it affects people's emotions. So it's very, very complicated work, and there's a lot of directions for the future, a lot of different ways we can go. Conceptualizing and measuring emotional well-being, kind of returning to where we started, that this is a really big project. Sandy has been leading a team where they're doing systematic reviews of self-report, and Fumiko has been leading a team looking at ways that emotional well-being, or some aspects of emotional well-being, have been looked at, like physiologically, psychophysiologically. So it's very, very broad area. So there's a lot of ways to go there. And then the different types of MBIs, and I hope I've conveyed a little bit of the complexity. I've been most interested in yoga and been studying it for 10, 11 years. And I'm like, wow, it's, I feel like we're just scratching the surface of it. So a lot of complexity, even within the MBIs, and then really doing more of the mechanistic work to focus on what it is that's happening in these interventions that is having those outcomes. And again, that allows us to potentially do more optimization, more tailoring, more tinkering with the intervention to make it potentially more potent and have more of an effect that we're hoping it has. So I tried to leave time today for discussion. I think this is something that we have a lot to learn. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. And so folks can either put questions in chat, or I believe that Josh is planning to be able to allow you to unmute yourself at this time to engage these conversations. I'm not even sure where to start because there are so many. We could do this for like 4 hours, not just 40 minutes, right? But I'll leave it to folks to start us off. And Josh did say that folks can unmute themselves independently now.
Hi, Crystal. It's Mary Guerrera here from UConn Med School. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Mary.
Can you hear me okay? All righty. Thanks for such a wonderful presentation. I had a question and then a thought about this whole idea of the emotional well-being. So one question, this is kind of a real specific to the yoga practice. It was really intriguing to see that spider graph of the different styles of yoga with, the different emotional, like spiritual, physical, contemplative. I'm wondering, and I know you know about the doshas within Ayurveda, so the Pitta, Vata, Kapha, and that some of the Hatha yoga positions or practices are, I think, classically designed for different doshic types. So, so I'm just wondering if that was kind of looked at, or if that's a whole nother layer of complexity. Like if I'm a Vata person and my Vata needs to be calmed, maybe the physical is going to resonate with me or help me come back into balance more than if I was, or that would exacerbate it, excuse me, versus the Kapha where I need to get moving more. That was just a specific question. Then I have one more thought after that. You want to address that?
Yeah, that like so Mary's referring to sort of a Ayurvedic perspective on how yoga may help, and particularly whether types of dosha, like types of body constitution, have are a moderator essentially of the effects of yoga. And particularly different types of yoga might have different types of outcomes depending on the specific constitution of the person. And I'm not aware that people have looked specifically at that. I think that's a really interesting question about. So I was in this talk really trying to focus a little bit more on the mechanism, but the moderation is also really huge. Like, do these interventions work better or worse for different people, or are there different, combinations that are gonna be more or less? It's just so complex. But that's a really good thought.
Yeah, it is complex. So I know that's a real specific question. My other thought, and I'm looking forward to following up with you after today's talk for more conversation and dialogue about this. But the idea of like eco wellness or eco well-being. In other words, this idea of forest bathing or immersing into the natural environment or having some contact with the natural world, or also the concept of rewilding, going out into the natural world. And is anyone looking at this? I know you're saying the research directions, you're looking at diversity and aspects of emotional well-being. I'm just wondering if you know of anyone actually evaluating that, like nature and the effect on well-being.
When you said that, that just triggered something that I read. Somebody at UConn was like over in Yes.
Crystal, I think it's actually Fumiko has been partnering with, but I can't remember who it was.
Yes,
so I don't,
it was from us and University of Georgia people did this. Yeah,
You
so
want
it was
to talk a little
on, well, okay, so I'm not the senior author on this one, so I'll be upfront about this one. It looked at cultural diversity and cultural diversity comparing Asian cultures and American cultures and how they show affinity with nature and how that impacts social emotional outcome during the COVID era. And so that's exactly what we showed. We didn't get into the mechanism on this one. This was a larger scale kind of survey data and using also large existing data from the past and comparing that also to the COVID period. But I'm happy to share with you the paper.
Yes, thank you. It would be great.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say there's also some comments in the chat that you might want to check out, which there's actually also another question. So I don't know if we want to look at that question, Crystal. It was a couple back in the chat now, and it was a question about whether online yoga or MBI interventions have been considered, or if you're aware of any studies, and whether or not that those are more or less likely effective, equally effective, especially given our isolation brought on by COVID.
Yeah, that's before COVID, people were just starting to get interested in these synchronous or asynchronously delivered interventions. And then when COVID happened, everybody had to shift to, like, anybody in the middle of a clinical trial. Like, we were just starting our yoga for back pain study at UConn, Angela Starkweather and I, and it was not designed to be an online intervention, but like, we either had to start or not. So we and many people around the world suddenly became online yoga dispensers. So it was like pretty wild. And I don't think the research is in yet. There's a lot of anecdote where people are feeling like it wasn't as potent because, partly people don't have to make the effort. And one of the things we know is when people make an effort and invest in something, they feel like more like they want to get something out of it. But on the other hand, the attendance is better. And some of the barriers are reduced and it's more accessible for people. So there's a lot of, I think there's going to be post-COVID, in the next few years, people are going to start having comparison data. Like if you were in the middle of a clinical trial when COVID happened, you have half your sample at real time and half your sample, of course, dealing with COVID, but now they're all virtual. So you're going to be starting to see that. And I know that NIH is really interested in being able to do, if these interventions can be delivered online, it's just so much easier in so many ways. But then we don't know what we're losing. That's a really good question.
Kim, so Fumiko and Caroline have put the article that Fumiko was referencing in the chat, and Kim Gans has asked if anyone knows if folks have studied these types of interventions with childcare providers or family childcare providers. I'm not aware of any particularly myself, although I think it's an area of critical need based on some other work that we've done. There was a woman, I have to find her name, she's at the University of Delaware, that was looking at daycare providers, in particular around other aspects of wellness. So not just kind of this mind-body space, but about all healthcare spaces. I don't know, Fumiko or Crystal, do you know of anyone?
Well, I mean, no, I'm more familiar with like Alzheimer's caregiver type research than child caregiver. And I know there's been some research out there on stress reduction in yoga, not necessarily the emotional well-being side of things. But I think it's been very promising. The problem with caregivers is that they're responsible for giving care. So when they have a couple spare hours, do they want to meditate or do yoga, or do they want to go to the grocery store? And, like, I think it's been really challenging for those interventions with caregivers to insert themselves in that way. But I think that they've been shown to be helpful for the people who do them. But I don't know about like child caregivers per se.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So one of the areas of research that we were working on before the pandemic, but then certainly got amplified as a result of the pandemic, was family caregivers of children with disabilities in particular, who have all of the things you just mentioned, but magnified as barriers to their care. And so we had been working, and I have a wonderful student in a dissertation. Her dissertation was on doing a Facebook delivered intervention that could involve yoga, but could also not. It was a tailoring intervention to let folks choose their goals for particular aspects of well-being, and it found very good effects on their psychological distress variables, but we didn't include emotional well-being at that time. So our future work will, of course. Is there another question? We've got about 10 minutes if folks have other questions.
Hi, Crystal. This is Bonnie McCree at UConn. I really appreciate the talk. It was very interesting and good to see you again. It's been many years. I'm wondering how you measure other moderators of effects of yoga, and I'm thinking particularly substance misuse, alcohol or other drug use, and its effect on mind-body wellness or even nutrition. Are those factors that are measured beforehand, before these studies are started, and kind of follow throughout?
No, I haven't seen people looking at things like that as moderators. I mean, there's research on there's a little bit of research on yoga and meditation with substance abusers. Even we've been doing a little bit with medication assisted treatments. So I know that there's some interest in those populations, but I haven't seen it done as a moderator of that. Did you have thoughts about how that might change the impact of the interventions?
No, just curious to understand what maybe pre-batteries are performed on individuals before they enter a study to kind of measure what intakes they have as far as other things that might affect mind-body wellness. I didn't know if there was like an overall pre-test or post-test or stuff like that.
I think it varies a lot depending. So like for our back pain study, a lot of the questions are about the back pain and also, opioid use and things like that. But we're doing a study of yoga and meditation for college students with alcohol problems, and that, we do a very different battery for that group. Even though, substance abuse is a big part of it, we're more interested in like family trauma and things like that. So I don't think there's, the yoga has been, and meditation too, and some of these other MBIs have been applied across really different populations. So I think they use really different, kind of batteries to look at those things.
If there isn't another question, I would like to turn the question myself back a little bit to this U24 network, and particularly the measurement aspect. So we've talked a lot about the mind-body piece, but as you started us off in the very beginning, where our joint project is right now, is focusing on where are the gaps in measurement and EWB measurement. And of course, I want to make a plug for the RFA, which is, why not get 30,000 or whatever amount you need to add some of this aspect to your projects, which is due in January. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what are your thoughts about what is most needed, or what are the challenges? Where do we go? What would be a good pitch?
Is that for me, or is that
for you?
For me. Well, having just like gone through here and tried to sort of map on the EWB with the MBI, um, the reflective piece, like I think that we know how to measure emotional well-being, the more hedonic side, happiness or joy or positive affect. There's a lot of at least self-report. I mean, I don't know, Fumiko, maybe like from like a fMRI perspective, there's a lot of room, but it's self-report. I think it's got it, but but that reflective side, especially thinking about the goal piece, if that is part of our definition, and people who have high emotional well-being are people who can productively and functionally pursue their goals. How do we measure that in these different ways? So self-report, behaviorally, physiologically, I don't know, is there a blood test for goal pursuit? Like I think there's a lot of room there.
That would be great.
Yeah.
So it's open to interpretation, and we encourage wide thinking and innovative thinking to move the field forward. Are there any other questions as we're nearing the end of our hour? Hearing none, on behalf of the M3EWB network and InCHIP, I want to thank everyone for participating today in hearing this wonderful talk from Dr. Park. I also would like to encourage folks to join the network at m3ewb.research.uconn.edu. It's housed within InCHIP, so I think we can put some links out to that as well, so that you can learn more about what all of the 6 funded networks are doing and be part of what we're doing. Thank you, Crystal, very much for getting us getting our feet wet and jumping right in there.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everybody for your time today. Appreciate it. And I'm always happy to talk about yoga. If anybody wants to talk about yoga, come find me.
And I can also attest to that, as Fumiko can as well. She's always encouraging us to do yoga with her during our team adventures. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a safe and lovely rest of the end of your year.